Thank you very much, Itai, for being with us. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. And I'm really privileged to be here. It's my first time in Madrid, and I'm really overwhelmed by the city. What a breathtaking city, and by the university. And I'm a geographer, and sort of a political geographer. And I do negotiations over natural resources. That's what I've been doing for the last 28 years. Until about 6-7 years ago, I mostly worked on water negotiations, mostly infrastructure, massive infrastructure. And about 6-7 years ago, I switched to energy infrastructure. The stuff that I do usually combines some basic notions in economics. I'm not an economist. It brings together political science. It brings together conflict resolution and some political geography and some environmental sciences. So I'm not really bounded to a particular discipline. I'm somewhere in between. And so essentially what I do is governance of natural resources. This is what I specialize in. And the topic that I will present today, actually, I started studying it about, I would say, 10 years ago. And so it's sort of reorganizing or repackaging a bunch of papers that I did in the last 10 years. And in retrospect, I realized that they all have something in common. And what is in common is the fact that we are dealing with intangibles. You're probably curious, what does it mean, intangibles? So we'll get to it in a second, okay? I'm extremely informal. If you have questions, if I'm going too fast, do not hesitate to stop me, okay?
Okay. Yes.
Is it working? The mic?
Yes.
Right. So I would sit closer. No, it does. It doesn't switch. Now it goes. Now it's on. So as I mentioned, I have a weak spot for infrastructure. I'm really impressed by massive infrastructure. And I got curious by the concept of a mega project. Actually, I got curious about it, I think it was 12 years ago. I did a sabbatical in London, and me and my wife and my kids, we were looking for a place for a vacation. And we flew to Santiago de Compostela. And over there, we realized that they just finished building Ciudad Cultura. Have you ever been there? Have you ever seen it? It's massive. It's huge. It's a library. I think it's the largest library ever built, even in the world. And we took a tour around Ciudad Cultura, and they told us that they ran out of money and they are unable to finish the project, and less tourists are coming than expected. So it really made me curious about a city, a relatively small size city, who decided to commit suicide and spend all of its fortune on a huge infrastructure. So that's what really triggered this type of study. So then I got deeper into what does it mean, a mega project. And apparently there is extensive literature on mega projects. And the mega project usually has a few features. The first one is it includes many stakeholders, developers, the regulators, NGOs, and others. And the threshold for a mega project is usually above 1 billion euros or dollars. So it's fairly expensive. And when you build it for the long term. You're going to stuck with it for decades. It's not that you build it and redesign it. I mean, it's like an elephant. I was about to say a white elephant. And once it is being built, it's going to have a far-reaching social impact. People would say it would change the way that we behave. Think on a huge highway. It change our transportation patterns. It may change where we live. It may change how we commute to work and so on and so forth. So people address it as a transformational type of infrastructure. It doesn't work, it doesn't move. Okay, just to give you a few examples of mega projects, and I'm sure that you're well familiar with them. The largest artificial island in Dubai. Never been there. Actually, now I can even go there. I'm sure you use the Eurotunnel, the longest undersea tunnel ever built, already 30 years ago. Have you ever been at the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River? That is the border between Nevada and California. It's still considered one of the largest dams ever built. It's worth visiting. So what's the issue about mega projects? Why I'm so curious about it? Apparently, when you review the literature, you would realize that it always, by definition, comes across what we call cost overruns. It costs by far more than what we expected, always. At least by 60, 70%, it would cost twice as much more than what we calculated at the beginning. The second feature is what we call benefits shortfall. It does not provide the extent of benefits that we expected. Think of a light train or a heavy train. The capacity is never 100% full, quite often not even 50 or even less than that. It's always raise emotions, and it's a very conflictual type of infrastructure. Some people hate mega projects, others, especially politicians, are obsessed with it. That's how they label themselves. That's how they perceive their legacy to be, like building a pyramid. So the public quite often, some of the public is usually against it, and it's quite often around uncertainties. And some would say, in a nutshell, a mega project is around uncertainties. You're uncertain about the cost. You're uncertain about the benefits. You're uncertain about the technology that you're going to use, and so on and so forth. It doesn't move, sorry. Up. To give you a few examples, this is a cartoon of the bullet train that is being built right now, which should connect San Francisco with Los Angeles. And you could see how it is being depicted in newspaper articles as shaky foundations, financially risky, and so on and so forth. Another example is the Red Dead Canal. It's supposed to be a water body, a water conduit that's supposed to connect the Dead Sea with the Red Sea, about 200, 300 kilometers type of canal. And this is how they envision it. Fancy hotels along it, huge infrastructure, airports, a huge, massive, futuristic infrastructure. So I guess now you are asking yourself, so what's the big deal? Why is it worth studying? So this is the big deal. The big deal is around the fact that although we know, statistically know that it's not going to provide the benefits, and it's going to cost at least twice as much, we still keep on building it. We are becoming obsessed to this kind of infrastructure. So the question is why? Why do we keep repeating our mistakes? It's a big question because it's a money spender. That's how we spend our taxpayer money. So why do we keep on doing it? This is a big question that Flaverberg posed about 20 years ago. And since then, there is a bunch of political economists who are studying mega projects. And I've been trying to connect to this body of literature and find a fresh and interesting angle which they haven't studied. So that's what I did in a way in the last 10 years. Another citation criticizing mega projects by Matthew Samitaki from the University of Toronto, and he has been working on light rails, and he has documented the same issue: provides less, costs more, and we keep on building it. Why is that? So the first phase was reviewing the literature and see what does it tell us about the why. Why do we do it? And you could divide the literature into three strands, into three directions that may explain why do we keep such a behavior. The first one is a technical explanation, and you could see some of the big names that are behind it, and they would say that we don't have the numbers right. We don't do the math or the economics right. We are unable to predict the users, we are unable to predict the cost of the technology, which means that we need better forecast modeling. Get the numbers right, and you would know exactly whether it should be built or you should avoid it. This is one type of explanation. The second one is more interesting, which is a psychological explanation, and you could see some of the big names behind it: Tversky and Kahneman. Kahneman got the Nobel Prize in 2002 in economics. He was from my own university until he moved to Princeton. Tversky was also from the Hebrew U. They argue that it's in our nature to do this type of mistakes. They argue that we are in a way delusionally optimal. It's like when you do lottery. You know, statistically wise, that there is almost no chance that you're going to win. But nevertheless, some of us may even become addicted to lottery, because there's always a slim chance that in a second you would become richer. So they've been experimenting with students, and they've been showing them the same situation each time framed or presented differently, and they've shown the way that how you frame, how you present affect your behavior. The third one is a classical political economy explanation, and it would say that there are interest groups and they disagree. Some is in favor of the mega project because they get some benefits. Maybe it would provide them more employment. Others are against it, and they would manipulate with the numbers and will present it differently in order to affect policymakers. So three different strands or directions for the bias that I've been describing. Then I realized that all of them have one thing in common, which is what I called the role of framing, discourse, and rhetoric. How we present, how we frame, how we package is extremely important for each of the strands. So actually, my presentation is about framing. And then I realized that there is massive literature about framing. Communication studies have been dealing with the role of framing for the last 50 years. And even the guys who do mega projects realize that framings and symbols are important, but they never study them because they come from a different background. They're not doing discursive analysis. They're not doing communication studies. Most of them are economists. They do benefit cost analysis, and they realize that quite often it doesn't fit, or you wouldn't know how to accommodate a mega project within a benefit cost analysis. So they do respect the role of framing. And then I realized that there is a sort of a loophole, a gap where I can contribute. So apparently in the communication studies, they work on framing, and you could see some of the basic literature about what does it mean to frame. And the argument is that the world is too complex. Each situation is far beyond what we could comprehend. And because of that, we think in terms of what they called primary frameworks. We compartmentalize. Like in Windows, we put things into boxes. This is how we think. And the argument is that if you present it in a particular way, if you argue that the problem is, if you present a problem in a particular way, it means that you could expect what would be the outcome or what would be the solution, which means that framing is a way to decide what is included in the problem and what is not included. It's like screening information and decided what to bring to the table and how to simplify it to policymakers. And you could see the way that Tversky and Kahneman addressed it. They said that the relative attractiveness of options varies when the same decision problem is framed in a different way. I will give you an example. When you go to the supermarket and you wish to buy ground minced meat, right? You're looking on the labels and it's the same product. One way of presenting it is by saying that it is 80% lean. So if you're on a diet, definitely you would go for it. And the same product can be presented differently. It could say that it is 20% fat. So it's the same product, two different ways to frame it, depending on your target audience. Okay, so if the issue is framing, let's dig deeper into the connection between framing and infrastructure. And now I would like to dive deeper into the difference between tangibles and intangibles. And the business administration literature would say that a tangible is a benefit or a cost which you could quantify, which is more objective, like job creation from a particular infrastructure. You could count the number of jobs that, for example, a desalination plant has established. If you build a dam, you could quantify how it would affect the quality of air or water. On the other extreme, we have intangibles. Those are more subjective. Those are really difficult to quantify. And you could see a bunch of them like a sense of pride. What does it mean, a sense of pride? How would you quantify it? Of course, you could run questionnaires. I'm aware of it. But you don't have like a device that you could measure the sense of pride. It's not physics, it's not chemistry. Geopolitics, the importance of geopolitics. What does it mean? How do I quantify it? The importance of what we call the peace dividend. How do I bring it into a project evaluation? Security, importance on national security. What does it mean? How much does it worth to the public? So these are examples of intangibles. As opposed to tangibles, I need to switch. Up, does it move? Up. So an example for tangibles, a pipeline, the Keystone pipeline that's supposed to connect Alberta in Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. And there is a big debate about how many jobs it would create. So it's debatable, but you could try and quantify how many jobs it would create, as opposed to intangibles. And I always like to start with one of my favorite films, which is James Bond. And did you ever ask yourself, why do you like James Bond? Are you familiar with the genre? Great. So why do you like it? It's what? Guy. Here you go, and the pretty girls, I know. So James Bond is a classical example for intangibles for a few reasons. There is always a geopolitical threat. Think of geopolitics as an intangible. And there is always a bad guy, and he is always bad looking, and there is always a seductive female, and there is always James. So there is a simple problem, and the problem has a single solution, which is James. So it's very easy to comprehend. So it's a good example for using geopolitics as an intangible. Now let me give you a few examples. On two examples from the Israeli setting, I'm sure that we can find other examples from the Spanish setting. On the right hand, you could see the canal that I mentioned that is envisioned to connect two water bodies. And the Israeli Water Authority describes it as a platform for regional cooperation. What does it mean? Will it materialize? How much it's worth? God knows. But guys, who is against regional cooperation? No one. The other extreme, a railway line that luckily hasn't built, that's supposed to connect the south with the center of Israel. And my previous prime minister argued that it has strategic and national importance, whatever it means. But who is against national importance? No one. Other examples that I've been working on, as I mentioned, I moved to energy into renewables. And quite often, the big benefits from renewables are in the form of huge solar farms, massive ones. And I'm sure that you have them in Spain, because they provide economics of scale. But at the same time, they are very controversial. They change the landscape, they change the scenery, they affect the environment, which means that you need to convince policymakers to buy into them, right? How do you do that? Intangibles, guys. Let me give you a few examples. This is a paper I did about 6 or 7 years ago. And usually I work on planning minutes, planning committees. There are two ways to do discourse analysis or to identify intangibles. One is declared preferences. You distribute surveys. I don't like doing it because it is a declared preference. You ask people, how would you behave in a certain scenario? It's not real life, guys. So I take a different approach, which is I try to document the way they behave in real life through planning and building committees. And in most places in the world, when you wish to build infrastructure, you need to go through a particular planning process. And usually the process is documented. So you could get the transcript and you could run a discourse analysis. And I always quantify the discourse analysis. So what I did here, I gathered all planning documents around about 100 initiatives to build solar farms. And I did the coding. And you could see in the x-axis, the players who raised the intangibles, geopolitical intangibles. So you could see whether it is the regulator, the private sector, or politician. And you could see the options, whether it is around energy independency as a form of intangible, whether it is around strengthening cooperation with your neighbor, whether it is around protecting the borders, or whether there are those who argue that the geopolitics is false. It's a framing device. And you could see their distribution, and you could see that they are mostly building their case around energy independency. Let's build our own solar farms. We will not be dependent on oil importation from South Africa or Russia or whatever, as an excuse for going for such a mega project. Another example, the good old-fashioned security. I'm sure you know exactly what I mean. And Israel got lucky about 12, 13 years ago. It found gas, huge, the largest gas reservoir that have been found in the last decade, just opposite of the Israeli coast. And there was a debate how to use the gas, how to bring it to the coast. And obviously there was a need to build a huge gas platform, an example for a mega project. And the argument was that we need to do it right now. It's urgent, we cannot wait. And another example about going back to the Red Dead Canal, the same contested mega project, and you could see how policymakers, some of them strategically frame it around a symbol of peace in the region as an example for intangible. Let's continue with the same example, the same Red Dead Canal that has been on the Israeli table for about 150 years, each time in a different version, in a different form. So once in a decade comes a developer and he argues, let's reinvent the canal, sometimes as an alternative to the Suez Canal, sometimes as a sort of a tourist attraction, as the new Disney World, sometimes in order to stabilize political relations with the Israelis and the Jordanians. And what I did in this paper, which I did with Karen Tenenbaum from Communication Studies, we tried to dig deeper into what we call the peace dividend. The assumption that if you build a pipeline, it will bring peace and stability, right? Sounds a bit ridiculous, I have to admit. I've never seen in my life a pipeline that brings peace and stability. I would say the opposite. I've seen countries fighting over pipelines. But the narrative was, let's go for the pipeline, and that would stabilize the relations between the Israelis, the Jordanians, and the Palestinians. I wish it was that simple. So what we did here, we did a discourse analysis of newspaper articles. So the data set was different. It was not planning and building protocols, but newspaper articles. And we systematically gathered newspaper articles from the Israeli media and from the Jordanian media. It took us about 2 years of doing it. And we ran a discourse analysis of about 400 newspaper articles. And you could see here the distribution of justifications in the Jordanian and the Israeli media. And you could see the categories. For example, water shortage, which is a tangible. You could measure how it would improve the water shortage. And you could see that it is mostly prominent as a justification in the Jordanian media. The second one could be the effect on the economy or the effect on the environment, which is more tangible. You could measure it. And the last one is the most important one, is what we call the peace dividend, the intangible. And you could see that in both cases, about 10% of the justifications were grounded in intangibles, the peace dividend. So we zoom in on the intangibles, and we realize that there are three ways of bringing the political benefit through infrastructure. The first one is the economic spillover. Think about how the EU has been established. It was around the coal and the steel industry, and the argument that it has established economic relations which spilled into trust. So you start with a low-key issue, and that would have a positive externality, a positive impact. So you could have the economic spillover, which you could identify in each newspaper article. You could have the environmental spillover, which is a slightly different type of rationale. The idea is, let's leave it to the scientists. Let them negotiate the pipeline. because physics is universal. They speak the same language. They have a common ground. If they do understand, it would have a positive effect on the politicians. This is the assumption. We could have the political spillover, and the argument is that if the Israelis and Jordanians are negotiating a pipeline, they will bring on the Palestinians, and that would strengthen the Palestinians as a political entity. And the fourth one is no mechanism, in the sense that you read a newspaper article and you try to figure out how come it would bring peace and stability. And you could see that in about 40 or 50% of the newspaper articles, they do not explain how it would do the trick. But they would say, wait, stability would come. And you could see the distribution between the Israelis and the Jordanians, and you could see the striking difference. For the Israelis, it's mostly the economic spillover. For the Jordanian, it's mostly the environmental spillover. Now let's move to one of my favorite topics, which is the role of urgency. Me personally, I really hate urgency. I don't know how to cope with it. And I always have a gut feeling that if you make urgent decisions, they're going to be terrible decisions. And apparently it is supported by the literature. And you could see my previous prime minister, how he has been manipulating the notion of urgency. And whenever there was a controversial infrastructure, you always brought the notion of urgency. We need to do it right now, on the spot, otherwise the market would not wait for us. Think about the Israeli gas discoveries, and he made the argument, we need to export it right now because the price of gas would go down, for example. And the argument is, let's make it urgent as far as possible. And the literature would support my gut feeling, and it would tell us that when you take urgent decisions, you do not consider the entire options. You go for one option. And in retrospect, again, the literature would say it's likely to be the wrong decision. In other words, take your time. Do not buy into politicians that tells you there's no time to wait. And you could see again a few nice quotations about how urgency affects decision making. And what I did here with a previous student of mine, Yosef Van Wyk, is a linguistic expert. And we use his expertise in discourse analysis. And we decided to do, again, a discourse analysis based on planning committees. So we decided to work on the gas platform, the controversial one that was built in front of the Israeli coast. The argument of the prime minister that it should be built right now on the spot. And we built a data set of planning protocols of about 4 years of negotiation. And in each one of them, we coded the notion of urgency. How do you deliver urgency? Who delivers it? For what purpose? And mostly, how do you institutionalize urgency? Sounds familiar, right? Think about the COVID. How do we institutionalize the urgent, the emergency measures which we need to take right now? But COVID, I guess there was a case. When it comes to infrastructure, I was really skeptical about it. So you could see here the breakdown around who raises urgency, and not surprisingly, you could say that it's mostly the regulator. Why the regulator? Because he's the one that is accountable for building it too late or too early. If it will be built too late and the price of gas will go down, then the public would go to him and tell him, why did you hesitate? Why haven't you built it right now? So it's mostly the regulator who was using urgency as a justification to build it right now. Need to switch, please. Okay, now we decided to dig deeper into the regulator, and you could see the breakdown between different ministries. For example, the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Finance, and so on and so forth. And you could see the option, and each option is actually the justification for urgency, whether it is an environmental justification. For example, we better burn gas than burn oil because oil is more polluted. There is the issue of energy availability. We may come across an energy crisis, so you better develop the gas reservoir. It could be a question of affordability. Gas would be cheaper, and we better take into account poor communities. It could be around foreign dependency. The earlier we move to gas, the more we will be self-sufficient. And it could be an economic justification. And the issue is that you could see how each ministry justified the use of urgency. Apparently, it has also a temporal dimension, and the urgency does not pop up in a random manner. So we did a timeline of the use of urgency for about 5 years and the frequency of the use of urgency. And you could see that, like in the COVID, it comes in waves. There is a spike of the use of urgency, and the spike usually corresponds with some external events, like an intergovernmental committee to make a decision, a pending core decision. And in between them, there is a time of low use of urgency. So if you identify a pattern, you could identify how newspaper articles or how planning committees would look like, or the timing that they are going to use urgency as an excuse. But I've been, in a way, simplifying things. I made a distinction between tangibles and intangibles. In real life, we tend to mix them together. You could see here a nice quotation of a massive developer that luckily went bankrupt in the last few years. And he is like the mother or father or many of the contested mega projects for money making, of course. But he always camouflage it under the pretense of intangibles. Let's see what does it say about the Peace Canal, the Red Dead Canal. The peace dividend can create a huge number of jobs, most of them for the Palestinians. So you could see it is a tangible, but at the same time, it will make them think more about working rather than fighting, which will bring regional prosperity. So you could see a very nice mixture. Peace, jobs, prosperity, who can say no to it? But as you could imagine, the use of intangibles is very instrumental. It is a strategic move made by particular players. So I was trying to figure out what stands behind it. What do they want to achieve? And mostly, how do they institutionalize it? Going back to the study that I did on the gas platform, we did a different type of coding, and we tried to identify what type of measures, institutional measures, they justify to make it happen right away. For example, 3 types of measures. One of them is what we call the repression of alternatives. Usually in planning, when there is a huge project, policymakers would have several options, several routes, and they need to choose between them. And they run a benefit cost analysis for each one of them. That's how they decide. In this case, they argue that the situation is so urgent, you cannot have the liberty to negotiate or decide between a dozen of them. Let's have only 2 of them. And you decide between 2. The other option is what we call streamlining the process. Instead of letting the public 90 days to object to the infrastructure, let's give them 2 weeks or a month because it's urgent. We can't wait. And the third one is exclusion of actors. You don't want to bring all the messy and vocal NGOs. Let's bring maybe one of them, maybe two the most. Otherwise, you cannot control the negotiation process. So you could see the frequency of each of ways to institutionalize urgency, and you could see the players who actually are making use of them. And again, not too surprisingly, it's mostly the regulator who is quite fond of streamlining the process. But I'm sure you remember the third law of physics of Newton. This says that for every action, there is a counter and equal reaction. And some players dislike the use of intangibles because they know that it is a strategic move. What am I doing in terms of time? No? Okay. Okay, great. So you could see a few quotations about how they challenge the use of intangibles. This is a parliament member that argued that there is no rush to decide about bringing the Israeli gas to the market. And there is no way that we are going to sell it to the Egyptians in order to bring peace because they have enough gas of themselves. They just found a huge gas reservoir a few years ago. So she contested the use of intangibles. Another example, another representative of an NGO who was saying that intangibles are a smokescreen. They are a way to divert us from the tangible cost of a project. So if you deal with the alleged peace dividend, you're not going to measure how it would affect the water quality. Another example, and this time it's about challenging the benefits of intangible. And this said that it may be an intangible, but it would be a negative intangible. Because when you build infrastructure, a joint one, you're more likely to fight over it rather than to cooperate over it. Let me skip it, let me skip it, let me skip it. And so it's a sort of a review of a bunch of papers that I did with a few students of mine in the last 10 years. And then I realized, then the question is, what do I do with it? Where do I take it next? And so it's a sort of a roadmap, which I haven't used because I was a bit exhausted from doing quantitative discourse analysis. It's very time consuming. It could take, just building the data set could take sometime even 2 to 3 years. And I ended up in master's students doing a master's degree in 4 years, which is not good. The university didn't like it. I mean, eventually there was a publishable paper that came out of it, but it gave me a bad reputation. Go to Itai and it will take you 4 years to do a master's degree. So it's a sort of a roadmap about what else you could do in terms of studying intangibles. So it starts with the construction of a mega project, and you need to identify and quantify the discourse. And the discourse is a function of what triggers the discourse. It could be internal measures or external measures like the COVID or the invasion, Russia invading Ukraine, which would affect the discourse of a particular infrastructure. And when you do build an infrastructure, you always need to ask yourself, when are you going to use the discourse? What type of discourse? And who stands behind the discourse? It also resonates with the linguistic tools that you're going to use to portray a particular story. This is a very interesting niche, which I haven't materialized, which is around emotions. How do you trigger action? Through giving the argument an emotional flavor. And we know that when we are emotional, we tend to act differently. And then there is the question, the stage of how would you institutionalize the intangibles? And I've given you a few examples. And the last one, which is the most tricky one, which I do not know how to quantify, it relates to the policy implications. How the use of intangibles change the way that we behave. And it's a big issue, and I was unable to quantify it because you could never isolate what what tick the behavior of policymakers. And most of them would not tell you because you were using too many intangibles. They would come up with other argumentations. And these are some possible directions which I haven't taken about the study over intangibles. For example, ways to incorporate intangibles into benefit cost analysis. And there are cases that they had to confront, for example, the role of peace. How would you bring it into traditional economics? We need to find out about, do intangibles crowd out good old-fashioned economics? Can you blend them together? We've seen that we use intangibles together with tangibles. How do you create a mix of the two of them together? Do you mix them together? There is the front about emotions as a way to influence behavior, especially around mega project. And this is a new front that many behavioral economists and psychologists are doing nowadays. And they rarely bring it to the notion of infrastructure, because especially psychologists, they're not dealing with infrastructure. They're dealing more directly with human behavior. So if you mesh together emotions and framing and real infrastructure, then I think you have a new avenue of study. There is the question of how to institutionalize it, and that's about it. So as you could see, it has started as a single paper, and it ended up in a decade of project, which I actually, in a way, stopped in the middle. So that's where I stand.
Well, let me first take advantage. Let me first take advantage of my position as a moderator, and I will introduce a couple of questions. One of first, one is about the urgency of the decision, no? Because it's very interesting the figure that you showed previously, but my question is the correlation with the political cycle on the agent that takes the decision in terms of, for example, it's not the same independent regulator that if the decision is taken by the politician, I mean by the minister of whatever. Actually, one of the main explanation in terms of supporting the existence of independent regulatory authorities is precisely to avoid the direct influence of the political cycle, no? Because in the sense that, okay, I'm not worried about the next election, and that's the case for the politician, because I want to sign this project because I want to have my name in the inauguration and the plaque, know that I was the politician who provided the support to this mega project. And this is very common in all projects, no? That psychological, or I don't know how to say, position is clear. And I have some examples of that in Spain. So that's my first question. No? That it depends on the body that takes the decision. In both cases are the public administration, but not the same way. It's not exactly the same independent regulator than a politician, no? That is driven by other factors. And the second question is precisely, is very interesting because, well, I'm going to introduce the example, and it's 2 days ago. On Monday night, there was an interview to the Spanish Prime Minister in the TV. Everybody, I suppose that saw the interview in the Spanish TV. Of course, in the middle of the Ukrainian war and so on. And one of the questions was about of course, your strategic position now in terms of energy. That is now a new open question. Well, not new in the sense that, of course, it's more urgent now than 3 months ago, 1 month ago. And it was clear for me that it was, well, I was involved, I told you before, in a cost-benefit analysis of a mega project in Spain that is a gasoduct between Spain and France. And it was rejected, I'm talking about 2 years ago, even though the cost-benefit analysis with intangibles, well, the frontier between intangibles and tangibles is not always clear because nobody understands the same. But what is intangible is what's tangible. I mean, environmental consequences and so on, and it was rejected in a pure economic and practical sense. No, nothing to do with intangibles. No, this is not profitable in economic sense. But how do you frame now that idea? Okay, forget gas and put hydrogen. Okay, it was shocking for me because nobody has told about hydrogen up to now in order to sell that project. However, if you want to reopen that project, you have to add something new, and something new is hydrogen. Even though in Spain, the amount of molecules produced green hydrogen is 0. Nothing at all, 0. So, but you can, but you say in the TV, okay, but don't worry because we will put hydrogen in that gasoduct. It was shocking for me because I said, okay, but this is completely new. You have to sell the project, but you have to frame it in a different way. You have to envelop the project in a different way. And it's very interesting because I was listening to you and I say, okay, this is perfect for this example. How we resell the thing you want or whatever you want to call it, this project, but in a different way. So two different questions. Your experience in repackage, how we repackage the project in a different way, and the political cycle. That for me is very clear how political cycle influences.
Two great questions. I think that the take-home point is, as Diego mentioned, it's about packaging. And this is why I use the metaphor of a box. Because you need to pitch it, you need to sell it to policymakers. Which brings me to the first question about how do you make a clear division between the bureaucratic level and politicians. And unfortunately, maybe it's not unfortunately, maybe this is how it should be. Whether it comes to massive mega projects, I would say that it's almost impossible to differentiate between the bureaucratic and the political level, because at the end of the day, the cost is so immense. It has to be, in most cases, a political decision. I mean, the bureaucracy, they would do their calculus, they would decide whatever, in what shape, in what form, in what cost, and then they need to bring it to the political level. So the distinction, especially around mega project, is not so clear. It's not clear cut. Whenever on one side the bureaucracy, on the other side the politicians, they are mixed and they walk one next to the other. I mean, when there is a ministry, he gets his guidelines from the minister, and the minister is by definition a politician. About the time cycle, you're right, and bureaucracy does change along the process. So it's a sort of I would say, a distortion in the figure. To do it the right way, we should have kept the same variables, the same players, or maybe isolate a single player and how he behave a long time. I haven't done it, you're right, because players may change as well as their behavior. So it's a weakness in the figure. So that's the first question. The second question was about switching hydrogen with gas. It's funny because for working about 20 years about 30 years about mega projects, I realized that they never die. It's like, have you ever seen the film Resurrection 10? Whatever, at some stage are being resurrected again, but in a different shape or form, switching from coal to gas to hydrogen, and God knows what else could flow into those pipelines. But the issue is that you need to sell it. They are so this is why I started the presentation about how contested they are. And the more contested they are, the more it takes framing and discourse and packages to sell it to the public and decision makers. So that's in a way, in a nutshell, the message. So if you are trying to identify how the discourse would look like, go and figure out how contested it is, and can assure you, the more contested, more packages, more intangibles, more framing, the entire party.
Actually, in that context, security of supply is now the key issue, because now in the context I'm talking now on these days, no, you read the newspapers today, you see strategic consideration, what is the role of Spain in providing energy to like a south country to the rest of Europe, in particular in gas, security supply, energy independence. Now, I understand that there are objective reasons to rethink about that, but my point of view is that the urgency that we are living now can be dangerous, in the sense that the short term and the long term, due to the huge amount, as you say, no, because these projects means billions. Well, billions when you have the initial project, no, when you have the final invoice, no, and the cost is multiplied by 2. It's very, very problematic. No? In Spain, there was a discussion with the high-speed train. Really, you know that the dividends of high-speed train, there was a huge controversy. Exactly. How important it is for the social cohesion. Exactly. And social cohesion is another intangible, no? The social cohesion, when you have to manage with
when you have to manage with very complex institutional frameworks, sometimes you need urgency as an excuse to go beyond the natural difficulties. For example, in the context of European Union yesterday, Borrell was claiming in the European Parliament from the importance of the pandemic and the current war for going beyond the natural taboos in the construction of the European Union, because in order to in this same room, Emilio will remember that we talk about the decision about the European Union we had some years ago. One of the issues was that the construction of the defense of the European Union was with was at the very early stages of the construction. The different countries didn't have the 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 interest of building this defense capacity of the European Union as a whole. And now these days, because of the current war, we are rethinking about it and going beyond the usual claims. I don't remember how very different political parties in the European Parliament have agreed so fast to buy arms for an external country, and the urgency claim is also a trigger to go beyond the I don't know how to say if it could be called inefficiency, but sometimes the typical barriers for going beyond the limits of the very complex institutional framework. The only way to go beyond these limits is when you have a very urgent issue. It's demonstrate that you cannot stay more in the same position as usual. And this happened with the gasoduct and any other alternative which is not was not profitable at the beginning, but now is profitable because you are trying to overcome a higher problem like your energy dependency. Yeah. Yeah. Of course, I completely agree with your view and your skeptical view about the intangibles and the role of intangibles in the decision-making process. But from my point of view, it's also true that urgency sometimes is like the unique manner for obtaining this enough consensus for making the decision step forward. But
The problem is that urgency is a soft concept in the sense that it did not always come down from Mount Sinai. It's a social, it could easily become a social construct. It's an instrument, it's a device, it is a strategic move. And I think we've seen, at least in the case of the COVID, that unfortunately there is a trade-off between urgency and democracy. One comes at the expense of the other. So it has a downside. It has more than one downside. It erodes democracy. And at the same time, we've seen that quite often you get the wrong decisions because you do not take the time to weigh all the options. So whenever I'm confronted with rhetoric of urgency, I'm becoming really scared of, because I know I could expect what comes next. Contested projects that in regular processes would not go through. So you need to bring the urgency to overcome the traditional decision-making process. And if it works for a politician one time, I'm sure that he will try it again. It has become sort of a system.
No, probably what you will need to change the whole system of decision process to avoid the use of the urgency.
Right.
It could be it could be the right position, the right decision, or the right change to be done. But unless you have enough consensus for changes the whole procedure for making the right decision process, it is the case. Is how to change the things that enough people don't want to be changed. So it's and in the case of Spain, for instance, in the case of COVID, we have seen how the national government adopt several measures of restriction regarding the social mobility of people and so on. After that, I don't know how to say in English right now, but they have been declared as illegal after 1 year. 1 year after the measures, the justice say that it was not possible to tell the people not to go out of the house, so all day home. So again, is perfect. It's a perfect example of
Right.
your
Right.
exposition, because you have the urgency of adopt measures to stop people moving around in order to get a more secure position in terms of health, but at the same time you don't have the legal possibility for doing this, and the urgency is the unique argument valid for adopting the measures.
Okay, then thank you very much, Itai. I guess I don't see. I have one question, sorry, because I have one question. Would be how psychology could be used for practical matters, for example, adequately financing the sanitation and water distribution network, avoiding water losses, as well as much needed treatment plants. We know psychologists could be used for practical matters. I don't know. I'm not an expert in psychology.
Me too. Me too. But I do. I mean, when you review the literature, you realize that the next front in environmental studies is environmental psychology, as it was about a decade ago, or decades ago, around behavioral economics. But it's difficult because whenever I try to work with psychologists.
Yeah, but he says later that current polarization is a problem for making decisions that benefits in the long term. We can that right. That current political polarization for countries is not the best environment to take good decision. However, it's more, I guess, some kind of
no, it's
practical.
It's a good reflection. The problem is that psychologists, they have a different unit of analysis. They work at the individual level. And the type of analysis that I usually do is at the institutional level. And a bunch of individuals do not make an institution. So whenever I confront them with an issue, they would say, no, I don't, I work on individuals. I don't analyze institutions. So there's a sort of a mismatch between psychology and institutional analysis.
Okay, then thank you very much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure, guys.
For being with us and very, very interesting hot topic. Yeah. Thank you, Dave. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you.